everyone. Thank you for joining the talk today. This event is in collaboration with the Happiness Festival, organized by the Happiness Institute. The festival supports the WHO COVID Relief Fund. You can see the donation details via YouTube Giving. All donations can be matched double by Google. We are honored today to have Professor Anders Sandberg joining us to discuss mind uploading and future of happiness. Professor Anders Sandberg is a neuroscientist, science debater, philosopher, futurist, transhumanist, and author. Anders is currently based at the University of Oxford's Future of Humanity Institute, where his research centers on societal and ethical issues surrounding human enhancement and new technology. Anders is on the advisory boards of a number of organizations and often debates science and ethics in international media. Let's welcome Anders on stage.
Thank you so much for having me. So this has certainly already made my day in terms of happiness. So without further ado, I want to talk a bit about mind uploading and happiness, which is of course my excuse to actually get into my kind of research, which is about the large-scale future of not just human, but all forms of intelligent life in the universe, and what we can say about its limits. So my current research project, I call it Grand Futures. Suppose we survive and we get our act together. I know that might sound very much like a tall order right now, but so far we have survived, and we certainly are aware that we have problems and even are trying to deal with them. If we manage to overcome them, then what? How big and good could the future be? So my research is looking into not just the ways things could be turned into a disaster, but also if we survive, what can we do with it? So you could say that I'm looking a bit at the physical limits of utopias. And besides all the niceness that people expect from a positive future, there are of course these cliche ideas that, well, it should have material post-scarcity. We should have overcome all the limits for matter and energy in a sustainable way so we can get whatever we want. That's the most old-fashioned idea about a really good future. We can get an arbitrary amount of foods, we have nice shelter, we have pleasant music. Indeed, we are already living in a post-scarcity society by the view of medieval people. They could probably hardly imagine that there was anything that could become better than what we currently got. Except, of course, that we might aspire to a little bit more. And we also can notice that it's not just stuff that we care about. There is only so much chocolate you can eat per day. Once you have one golden palace, well, 10 more is not going to actually help very much. But we might want other services. Indeed, the medieval person might not envision the possibility of being able to talk to people far away, have automatic translation, translate things, or have people or software do things for them that they themselves couldn't do. You could also envision a form of service post-scarcity, a future where we have machine learning and automation that actually means that most work can be done. There are, of course, interesting questions already here about unemployment and what do you fill your life with when most things can be done really, really well. Another form of post-scarcity might be infrastructure. We're all dependent on a vast global infrastructure, many of which parts we don't understand at all. The different levels underlying the internet protocols making it possible for you to hear me are bewildering. And many of the pieces of software are very, very complex. And that's just a tiny part of a bigger system. And of course, even the material infrastructure of electricity and heating and food and fuel is very complex. It's too fragile. And we sometimes get fluctuations that we don't understand and definitely don't want. Even worse, in many developing countries, the infrastructure is really bad. And the main thing holding them back is that it's very hard to build that infrastructure. Now, if we had really good robotics and automation, we could imagine that building more robotics and automation to build that infrastructure. We could imagine the robots using solar power to build more solar panels to power even more robots to build even more solar panels to actually create sustainable energy sources on a very large scale. There are many forms of infrastructure we care about, including, of course, the health infrastructure. Again, we could totally imagine that in the future we might be able to automate parts of medicine, so we might have as much medical care we could wish for. But that's setting our sights too low, I think, because we might also want to actually modify ourselves so we're truly healthy. There are many things that are underlying the illnesses that we currently can't do very much about, like aging. Now, if we can fix aging, or if we can fix the molecular causes of many diseases, that would really improve things. However, there is one form of post-scarcity I've seen practically never mentioned, and that is happiness. What if we could have a future where we also have no scarcity of happiness? So right now, we might actually be living in a dark age of happiness scarcity. It's pretty clear that many places and many people could be happier. So if you ask people, you generally find that in quite a lot of developed countries, people are fairly happy. But even in developed countries, you find a great deal of variance between different countries. And if you go to developing countries, and especially places that have serious troubles, that are torn by famine and war or bad governance, you find that people are not very happy. We could get off into an interesting tangent here about how much we believe these kind of big happiness studies, but it's pretty clear that things can change both for the better or the worse. Overall, when you do the same measures over time, you find that countries generally tend to become happier, but not always. For example, we can see that in Greece, people were pretty happy up until the crisis hit in 2007, and then the unhappiness has stayed. Eastern Europe still bears the imprint of the years under communist rule, which has generated a rather gloomy outlook, which seems to be fairly persistent. And of course, this is also true for many smaller groups. You have communities that both because of external factors or internal factors are not as happy as we could be. Some good news is that we generally tend to underestimate how happy other people are. If you ask a member of a society how happy the rest of the members of a society are, they generally tend to underestimate this quite strongly. We tend to think that we are doing pretty well and all the others are really sad and gloomy, but it's not true. They're about as happy as we are. But still, even individually, there are enormous differences. Some people are naturally dark and gloomy, others are very chipper and cheerful. This is called the hedonic set point. It seems that just like we have a weight set point, a part of hypothalamus that estimates roughly how much fat tissue we have and tries to make you eat more so you get up to that set point if you have too little, and lose appetite if you have too much. And unfortunately, in most of us, the set point is set higher than it's healthy for us on a modern diet. We seem to have a hedonic set point we return to. Again, this seems to be an internal feedback system. When external events happen, we get happy or sad, and then we over time tend to return. It's not a complete return. When there are famous studies showing that when people win on lottery or are in an accident and become paraplegic, of course, initially they become much happier or much more sad, and then they return to the baseline. They don't return completely, but the most intense effects actually about. We adapt to anything. The sad part is, of course, we can adapt even to bad circumstances and say, oh, it's not so bad. We might want to sometimes be able to notice when we're actually in a bad circumstance and say, no, I actually need to struggle, get angry, and get out of this. On the other hand, quite a lot of human unhappiness is because we're in a problematic situation we can't do anything about, and then we just feel that misery. This is, of course, an endless source of inspiration for poets and philosophers thinking about the human condition, moaning about our mortality or all the other things that make life not quite as good as it could be. But there is another thing well worth moaning about, and that's the hedonic treadmill. It turns out that, well, when I get something pleasant, over time, if I get more of it, I either get satiated, like eating a lot of chocolate, or I just habituate to it. If I'm every day greeted by somebody singing a beautiful song for me, after a while I will want different songs and different styles. And I'm not going to be that satisfied by the same thing. Unfortunately, this of course leads to us becoming unhappy, but it has an interesting side effect. It makes us seek out new stimuli. And that gets us over to an interesting question. Why do we have happiness? What is it really good for? And I think the honest answer is it's evolution's fault. So evolution is not so much survival of the fittest as survival of the least inadequate. As long as you do some things right and get offspring that can send your genes forward, those genes are going to survive. So organisms that did the right thing often enough, they tended to survive. How do you ensure that the right thing happens? Well, a very simple thing is to have a simple sensor, for example, for nutrients. And if that sensor accidentally gets connected to something that makes the organism swim in the direction of nutrients, you're going to have a fairly successful organism. But that's very simple-minded. The reality of the world is a bit more like a maze. You need to have better plans. So what happens is that you get intervening layers in this neural network. We start getting things that very, very roughly approximate the value of actions or situations. So bacteria that find themselves in a low nutrient situation, they detect that and then start swimming in some random direction. They don't know where nutrients are, but anywhere is better than this place. Other systems notice that this seems to be good enough. Let's stop doing anything. Let's stop moving. And gradually you can, of course, build out and make this network more and more complicated. And this leads to what we in vertebrates call reinforcement learning, which started out as a theory in psychology that, well, rewarding stimuli lead to animals doing more of actions that led to those rewarding stimuli, while disrewarding or painful stimuli makes the animals avoid that. That gradually turned into a computational theory. It was modeled mathematically and then in computer software, and is now, of course, amazingly successful in the world of machine learning. Because now we can get deep neural networks that try to estimate the value of actions and situations, and without human intervention, other than defining where the rewards are coming in, trying to optimize behavior. And this, of course, leads to all sorts of creative and unexpected and sometimes very, very useful results. Google DeepMind has, of course, made a big name for itself by working on that. But the general theory is interesting because it actually seems to suggest that the things that are closely related to happiness in us humans might also be closely related to things that we actually are doing a fair bit of machine learning and neuroscience about. Indeed, when you start looking into the brains of mammals, you find that different systems in motivation seem to be responsible for slightly different things. There are the wanting systems, as some people call them, that creates desires for doing certain things. They see an opportunity for getting food or getting mating or avoiding something. And then there seem to be liking systems, the systems that actually, when they're activated, correspond to pleasure. And these ones are intended to subsume the third part, learning. So normally what happens is that when you encounter something pleasant that was better than you expected, then you get a liking reaction, and also you learn to want to be in that situation next time the context is the same. And this is very successful, except of course when you encounter something like an addictive drug that short circuits this whole system, or where you encounter situations where you actually can't learn the right thing and instead you learn random responses. So Skinner, the behaviorist psychologist, famously had these pigeons in cages that he could use operant conditioning to train. Indeed, during the Second World War, he actually trained them to pick the pictures of enemy ships, and he was suggesting to the US military that they could be used to direct the missiles at enemy ships. As my psychology textbook dryly wrote, unfortunately, the brass didn't think to entrust the weapons to these patriotic pigeons, so they never got a chance to show their method, which was probably the safest thing to do. If we think we have a bit of problem about ensuring verification and validation for our software, just think about pigeons. But that aside, one thing Skinner noticed was when you reward a pigeon just randomly, it will quite often associate that with what you did just before and do that. So if a pigeon happened to have been twirling around just before you gave it some seed, it will try twirling around much more to get seeds. So the end result is a lot of pigeon superstitions. And while we might laugh at that, well, look at gamblers. Indeed, look at most of us when we're using software. We do all sorts of weird little rituals, which actually don't have anything to do with reality, but just was because of the rewards and punishment we get from the software accidentally. After all, a slow loading web page is also a form of punishment. Why is that a punishment? Well, it's a neutral stimuli, but we expected something better and we get something slightly worse. Those temporal differences is really what we care about. And this is a reason we have such a problem with our hedonic treadmill. Similarly, if things are happening randomly, that's usually a stronger learning signal, which is again why people get addicted to gambling. Another interesting thing is, of course, that it's not obvious why this feels good. We could imagine that this is just neutral signals, yet happiness and pleasure feels happy and pleasant. And it's a deep philosophical and perhaps psychological or even physical question why there is a feeling linked to that. Philosophers have, of course, talked about happiness for thousands of years, literally. And quite early on, there was an important realization that, yeah, there is the kind of happiness you get when you get a piece of chocolate or hear a beautiful piece of music for the first time, or if you're a mouse, get a piece of cheese. It's the hedonic happiness. It's the pure pleasure. But many people do other things that they claim make them happy. And typically, they're complex projects. They're meaningful things. It might be doing things for charity. It might be teaching people. It might be climbing mountains. When you climb a mountain, it seems that most steps are actually fairly unpleasant. You're cold, you're wet, you're in danger, you have to exert yourself. And probably when you reach the peak of a mountain, you're probably not feeling that great bodily. Yet, the kick of getting up there, and especially afterwards when you say, oh yes, I climbed that mountain, makes it very, very meaningful. Indeed, when we're as deeply into a happy form of work or activity as we can be, we tend to forget about ourselves. Mihail Csikszentmihalyi, one of the leading positive psychologists, he's been working on the condition he calls flow, when we're totally engrossed in work. And he noticed that when you do that, you're not thinking about you. And indeed, we can see this in brain scans. When people are in a flow state, those neural networks that are normally involved in thinking about who we are and where we are and things like that, they get deactivated. It looks very suggestive, like the self actually dissolves when we're really happy with this form of eudaimonic happiness. Now, living a life of just pure eudaimonic happiness might be a struggling life. You're doing meaningful things, but you're not getting that much pleasure. Living the truly hedonic life, well, lots of pleasure, but you might not have much meaning. The really flourishing human life, presumably, is a combination. You do get your chocolate, but you also get to save people and inspire people. And the reason this happens is probably that we are hijacking the mechanism evolution built into us. Evolution just wanted us to do the right thing often enough and learn that. And one useful thing is to learn particular paths. If you're solving a maze, if you learn a good trick, you want to reuse that. It becomes a little goal on its own. So you might know that you need to get to a particular crossing if you think the cheese is in a particular corner. And then that sub-goal becomes something that is rewarding on its own, because you know once you get to that crossing, the cheese is not far away. If I'm doing math and my parents or teacher pat me on my head when I'm doing some math and say, good boy, I might learn to associate that math is nice. And gradually, I internalize that. The value, the pleasure I get from doing math no longer is dependent on people patting me on my head and telling me I'm doing fine. I'm generating myself. And before I know it, I'm going to be majoring in mathematics at university. We create our own sources of happiness, which is an astonishing fact. And I think it's a deep question for us in computational neuroscience and machine learning to try to figure out how does this balance itself? Because it seems like we should get addicted to this. And although, of course, critical spouses and outsiders might say that we are a bit too addicted to our books or computers or projects, it seems like we're not spiraling into something useless. It's not like a drug addiction that takes over everything. Mathematics might certainly make you a bit boring at the cocktail party, at least if non-mathematicians are around. But it seems to actually function well. Why this system is stable is a really important question, and I don't think we actually understand that. Generally, it seems like building smart, sustainable pleasures that tend to be open-ended. That's the trick to get around the satiation and the habituation. Sure, I solved that mathematics problem, but another mathematical problem towers behind that. I might realize that, I knew so little. There are more domains of knowledge, and that's an ever-ending growth, which also is useful maybe for writing papers, maybe for solving important problems out in the real life. Finally, of course, many philosophers point out that the reason we are happy might actually be for other things. Evolution certainly don't care about our happiness or pain. They're just tools for getting more fit offspring in the long run. And similarly, you might argue that many forms of happiness are just, we feel happy in order to make us pursue things like justice or excellence. More about that later. But I think it's an important realization that happiness itself might not be the end point. It's a signpost that at least something is going well. But we might want to know that the direction we're going in actually is a good direction rather than a pleasant one. I spent far too much time yesterday, when I should have been preparing for this talk, playing a computer game because it was rewarding me so much. It was difficult enough to give me a challenge, and I was forgetting myself and I was forgetting time. But after doing that for 2 hours, I realized, what have I been doing? I've been fighting a fictional enemy in a little fictional world. And although there are some interesting things about strategy I might pretend to have learned from it, in the end, it didn't matter that much. Maybe I should have been reading a good book or taking a walk or talk to some friends. So can we become happier? Well, the first way of doing that is, of course, to fix needless suffering. There is an important question about whether any suffering is valuable. Maybe we could just be moving around on gradients of bliss, as Dave Pearce put it in his amazing The Hedonistic Imperative, which is a philosophical work where he's arguing that we should remove all pain and suffering we can from ourselves, from all animals and the rest of the universe, and try to redesign ourselves completely. That is the second approach. Let's increase positive feelings in a sustainable way. But already fixing the needless suffering, it seems to be quite an important way of starting. So mental illnesses are sadly very, very common. A lot of people have depression and anxiety that prevents them from enjoying life. And obviously, we have a lot of people in the world who are suffering from material scarcity that causes the deprivation and stress that then causes suffering. So these things are worth fixing to become happier. There is this general finding that becoming richer eventually levels off to a fair degree. It's not that it ever stops. You can actually become happy by getting ever more wealth. It's just that you need ridiculous amount of wealth to improve happiness when it's really, really high. On the other hand, helping people who have very little wealth is actually quite efficient. So there are interesting things here where there are many neglected questions about suffering we might want to work on. And of course, if you're more of a universalist, like some of my colleagues at the Center of Effective Altruism, they point out that a lot of animals are suffering, not just lab animals or animals in factory farming, but even wild animals do not have lives that are that nice. Evolution doesn't care about their suffering. We might want to do something about that. But another interesting question is, are we very good at being happy? And it turns out that the results from cognitive science is that humans are surprisingly bad at recognizing things that they enjoy. You can do all sorts of psychological experiments where you can see that people don't choose the things that would make them happy. Sometimes because they don't recognize that it does make them happy. But quite often, even when they know it would make them happy, they still don't do that. Sometimes that is because they mix up the medium for the thing that they're trying to get. So the classic example is money. So it turns out that a lot of people are trying to acquire a lot of money because that allows you to buy things that could make you happy. But many people get very obsessed about getting the money rather than getting the happiness. And this happens if it's plastic tokens and chimpanzees too. Experiments have demonstrated that you can get chimpanzees to work very hard to get plastic tokens that allow them to buy bananas. And now we start hoarding the plastic tokens. We start treating the plastic tokens as if they were the valuable thing instead of the bananas. And I think this is a fairly common problem. We do measure the wrong thing, and then we pursue that. You could say this is a form of counterfeit utility. But could we actually make ourselves happy directly? So to the left in this slide, I have a picture of one of the rats in the old classic papers about sending signals into the pleasure centers of the brain. Although that paper never called them pleasure centers. It was written back in the 1950s when behaviorist psychology was ruling the world. And you don't talk about mental state. You can only look at behavior according to behaviorism. So this paper described how he put electrodes into the rats, and the electrodes stimulated the rats when they pressed a button in the cage, and they started pressing the button like mad. And nowhere is there any mention about happiness or pleasure. It took several years after this before Olds, in a Scientific American article, actually started calling it a pleasure center. And he admitted that it was obvious that the rats were enjoying it because you could see it in their faces. If you're around lab rats enough, you will start recognizing the facial dynamics. Now, the interesting thing about this stimulation, which is going into this wanting and liking system, is that it doesn't habituate. Basically, the rats kept on pressing as much as they could. There are these stories that they would starve themselves to death rather than stop pressing the button. They're a bit exaggerated and mixing up, stimulating in different parts of the brain. But it is a very special form of stimulation. The fact that it doesn't habituate is both very positive in one sense, but also seems to suggest that this is something that could lock you into an endless feedback. Indeed, a lot of people tend to think about wireheading this way. They see this as the epitome of a modern overstimulated world where we're all making super delicious food with maximum amount of sugar and taste, and saturate our media in all sorts of ways in order to induce us to consume more. And we end up a bit like the rats, literally in the rat race, trying to get tokens like money to buy more stimuli to do more. That's not just problematic from a sense of doing something useful, it might also be a bad feedback. Now, it turns out that humans and rats are not quite as single-minded like that. Indeed, it turns out that if you just stimulate the liking system, you don't get wanting, which sounds really weird because normally we always get them together. If I find something enjoyable, I will want it. But it might be possible to actually make things that are totally enjoyable without creating that acquisitive desire. Indeed, Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, argued this is what underlying proper aesthetic enjoyment. You watch a beautiful painting, but it's not like you need to have that painting. It's that you enjoy the beauty itself for what it is. And this is how we ideally, of course, should be enjoying each other. We should enjoy each other's presence, not just because we're useful to each other or sexy, but because each of us is a wonderful person in themselves. It also turns out that there might be possible to biologically modify these set points. So I seem to genetically have gotten a pretty good lottery win. I'm a very chipper and cheerful person. Other members of my family are either very chipper or very gloomy. It seems like we tend to get stuck in one setting. Exactly which genes are responsible is a bit unclear. In some cases, we know what genes are involved. There are some genes that do tend to affect personality a little bit. And there is at least one interesting case about pain insensitivity combined with a very natural high mood, where the lady who got it, she had been suffering for a lot of bad things through her life. She's still chipper and cheerful, and she's functioning. It's not like she's sitting in a corner drooling. No, she's a happy grandmother. It's just that she needs to be a bit careful when she burns herself because she doesn't feel that much pain. Now, could we create this to have a sustainable happiness? Could we improve our set points? I think it's doable. I think that's definitely what biology allows us to do. Excuse me one moment. Biology, of course, has all sorts of other annoyances, like coughing. So It might not be possible to get rid of all the problems. Indeed, we don't want to get rid of all forms of pain because we need to function in the world, but certainly we can do much better than this. But what about software? Could we have happy software and not just software that has smileys on it? Well, when I pet a cat, I'm happy. And the cat seems to be happy. How do I know that? Well, it's purring and it's not running away. And probably I can use that to infer that the cat likes it, because sometimes the cat even comes over and sits in my lap in order to be petted. So that behavior reveals something, even though we're somewhat different. In theory, it might be that cats absolutely hate to be petted, but they're all making this mistake of putting themselves into laps so they get petted. And they really hate that, and that forces them to return to laps. But that's a crazy model of how cats or humans work. In practice, we know that cat brains and human brains work around the same way, and it's pretty unlikely that we would consistently do things that we hate. But what about a piece of software? If a little robot curled up in my lap and looked like I should be petting it, do I know it's enjoying the petting? It could, of course, just be that somebody has programmed it, so it's an empty gesture. It could also be that it's a reinforcement learning agent, and somebody programmed it that it gets reinforcement signals from being petted. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's experiencing pleasure when I pet it. It could just be that it's updating a number. But this, of course, gets to the problem that do I know that the cat is actually experiencing pleasure? It's, after all, updating neurons. Indeed, when I'm enjoying things, I'm updating neurons. I happen to know this is linked to actually being happy. But if I can accept that neurons in my brain updating in the right way produce pleasure, why not cats? And in that case, why not robots? You could say, well, we know how that works. Look, the program is rather simple. But then again, biological neural network, for all the gory biological complexity, might also be fairly simple. It might just be that it's the function, the way they tie together perception to behavior that matters. This is, of course, an endless source of debate in philosophy of mind. Now, one way of exploring this would be, of course, to simulate things. So I've been working on brain emulation, what's sometimes called mind uploading. I don't quite like the word mind uploading because it already suggests that we know how to move a mind up into the cloud. And first of all, we don't know whether this would actually be a way of moving mind because we don't understand what minds are. I know what brains are. I know I got one in my head. I touched a few in the lab, and we roughly know how they work. We can also slice them up and scan them and reconstruct the neural network. We can run simulations of small neural networks on big computers. We can connect this simulation to virtual worlds and get virtual behavior. We still haven't succeeded in emulating an entire animal. People have been working for a long while on the C. elegans nematode, which has 303 neurons, but unfortunately it's rather hard to get the exact strength of the connections right to make a model that works really well, but we're getting there. It might be that the fruit fly actually is going to be the first animal where we have a one-to-one model of every neuron modeled by a computational neuron. And then we can start running experiments. Once we get to the virtual mouse, now we can start doing experiments like old, stimulating the pleasure centers, and presumably, if everything works out, we should see the same behavior. Does that tell us that the mouse software actually is now experiencing mouse happiness? Not necessarily. It might just be that it's behaving like an animation, a very complicated animation screen with no content. But it might also be that it's experiencing something. Indeed, we get to interesting ethical problems at this point, because I'm certainly not around to pinch a mouse in the lab in the tail for no good reason. That would be animal cruelty, and I might lose my license to do animal experimentation if I were to do something like that. But what about using a virtual reality glove and grab the virtual tail of the virtual mouse? Virtual signals get sent to the brain emulation, and the result is that the mouse runs away from my hand and hides in a corner. Have I caused some virtual pain here? Or some real pain? This is something we don't really know. We can't know. But it seems like the best safe approach would be to say, yeah, this is close enough to what we might expect real animals to behave like. And it's based on a real animal we actually do know we need to care a little bit about morally. We should not do this. Now, if we could get brain emulations or even normal software that could have feelings, we would also have a kind of ethical plutonium. On one hand, this is brilliant. We can produce a lot of happiness in the world. On the other hand, we have a terrible, terrible responsibility to not bring in unhappiness. If you could have robots that suffer or feel pain, you probably shouldn't kick them. So Boston Dynamics might actually have a problem here, since they tend to kick their robots quite a lot to demonstrate their balance. But if they feel pain, that's a bad thing to do. Indeed, we might want to think very carefully about making very powerful software if it can feel, because it could actually produce tremendous amount of suffering. Or for that matter, tremendous amount of happiness. And at least if you're a hedonist, you might then say, yeah, we should be filling all our data centers with that software. We should be running it as screensavers. We should spam the world with that software because it's just going to make the world so much a better place. That's going to be an interesting situation if we end up in it. So if it turns out that the good thing in the world is happiness, like the hedonists say, then we should obviously just make more brains. How many more brains could they make? Well, it turns out that on Earth, of course, you could have a lot more people. In principle, if we decide to just ignore natural ecosystems, we could have a few trillion people living in vast ecologies surrounded by soybean fields. Or if you really use nanotechnology and fusion reactors, you could have something like 10 to the 16 people living in a worldwide super building. This is very much 1960s science fiction. If you do something milder and just say, yeah, we might expand out in space, building space habitats, eventually go to other stars, then it turns out that inside the reachable universe, there is about room for something between 10 to the 38 to 10 to the 47 human lives across the future, assuming that we stay as biological creatures and use carbon and water. Those numbers don't mean anything to you. They don't mean anything to me because they're just ridiculously large numbers. Right now, we're almost 10 to the 10 people on Earth, but that's nothing compared to 10 to the 38. We can't imagine that large number of minds. And that's, of course, just brains living normal lives. What if we could exist as software brains? They could be a lot more effective. So it turns out that one of my subtitles was how much happiness can you get per watt and kilogram? And probably the optimum is going to be something like quantum dot cell automata. They're very, very energy efficient ways of using nanodots that can flip between different states. And they can do this very fast. And if you use the far future of the universe and all the mass energy we can get our hands on before it expands away, we can get up on the order of 10 to the 100 lifetimes of human equivalent brains. If they are happy and that aggregates, that's an amazing amount of happiness. That's a Google lifetimes of happiness. But of course, it might be that there are other architectures that can just be much, much happier. And there are reasons to think that. After all, stones don't tend to have much happiness. It seems like the introduction of life, and especially conscious life, added something to the universe that wasn't present before. And that boosted the total amount of value quite a bit. It might very well be that there could be other levels above that. Maybe there is happiness prime that's way better than mere happiness. And we have to discover that in the future super civilizations. It looks like there is potential for way more. It could, of course, also be that just having bigger brains allows you to be happy. So it turns out that mice have about 25,000 neurons in the ventral tegmental area, one of the parts of the liking system. Humans have 18 times more, 450,000 neurons. Can humans be 18 times happier than mice? Maybe, maybe not. I don't think we have any good idea about whether that thing even makes sense. But we can certainly be happy in more complex ways. Mice can be happy about cheese and companionship and other things. We can be happy about cheese and companionship too, but we also can be happy about science. Happy about, oh, I built a cathedral that future generations might like. oh, I'm understanding something about the nature of happiness. I think we actually have extra kinds of happiness that are way more valuable. And that chain might continue to the future. So the laws of physics limit the amount of computations we can do. Maybe experience of happiness is not computational per se, but it certainly requires you to remember things about what you're happy about, to continue your mental state from moment to moment. So we can use the computations to bound the total amount of kind of happiness computation that can be. And that's a very large number on the order of a Google. We simply can't imagine how much more it is. And we have only just gotten started. Of course, we might discuss whether we should aim at super happiness. Generally, for humans right now, happiness is a good thing. It's not just that a life that is going well makes you happy. If you're a happy person, your life tends to go better because you're nicer to be around, you're more likely to get the job, you're more likely to work on that task that needs to be done. So there seems to be a pretty strong feedback loop going. So this is another reason to work against unhappiness, to make sure we actually get that helpful well-being that acts as an attractive point. We don't know whether it's a top happiness. Certainly, stories about wireheading and drug abuse shows that you don't want the wrong kind of happiness. You can be in a state of total bliss that is not sustainable. Eventually, the heroin runs out. Eventually, you have to get a job. But there are other forms of happiness that seems to be sustainable. There are some people who learn how to master their impulses and go around in a state of bliss. And most importantly, what we want to avoid is false happiness signals, counterfeit utility. So this is what happens in the case of the wireheading mice and rats. Whenever they press the button, their brain gets told that what they did was right and good. It actually doesn't matter. It doesn't help their life go better, except getting into a paper in a journal for another species. But in this case, what we would like to have is, of course, that our happiness is linked to things that are actually valuable. Many philosophers of well-being argue that actually our happiness is a tool to aim at doing meaningful things in life. And we should try to figure out ways of avoiding these false signals. This is a little bit like Goodhart's law in economics and social planning, that when you have an index for something good, once you try to optimize for that, it stops being a good index. And similarly, many of our happiness signals behave like that. So back to the present. We're right now in the era, long before we have any brain emulations and really good ways of fixing our brains. But we can still do quite a lot of important things. First of all, if the future is as grand as it looks like it could be, then we better ensure that it happens. We better make sure we survive and thrive because we're here at the start of history. We actually do get a chance to set some of the agenda and trajectory. And if we could solve happiness as early as possible, then there is going to be more of a happy future. Second, the nature of happiness itself is really understudied. This might sound weird because we've been talking about it for thousands of years, but positive psychology is a fairly young domain. Using neuroscience to figure out what parts of the brain are involved in motivation and happiness and linking that to practical intervention is really understudied. There is so much more we can do. There is way more papers about depression and the negative states, which we really want to fix, than there is about the positive states that we want to amplify. But probably figuring out the positive states might actually be quite helpful for fixing the negative ones. And finally, there is a lot of small sources of unhappiness that false utility signals everywhere, both in the personal life or as a civilization. We might want to figure out how to solve that. When the signals going into government makes the government do stupid things because it's wireheading on GDP, for example, it thinks that is an index of how well it's doing, then that produces unhappiness on the civilization scale. When I'm agonizing about which pastry to choose, both are good. I'm wasting my time. I should just flip a coin or go eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Learning these patterns are very simple. Figuring out ways around small sources of unhappiness that we should spread to each other and then use to reduce unhappiness locally and globally so we can really, really enjoy this wonderful universe we're living in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anders, for a fascinating talk. I think you gave us an extremely multidisciplinary view on happiness. We are taking a few questions. Let's take one question from the floor. Thank you for the insightful talk, Anders. Is pain suffering universally bad? Can pain have positive effects?
So anybody who enjoys biting into a hot chili knows that pain can sometimes be absolutely delicious. But what's going on there is, of course, there is nociception. The pain signals from your mouth because the capsaicin releases substance P, and you know this is safe. You know that you have not harmed yourself, even though some nerves are screaming. So that form of pain is controlled. It doesn't turn into suffering. So pain as a signal is quite important because you need to avoid harming yourself, especially as a kid when you don't know what's safe and what's dangerous. So I think there are good forms of pain. There are harmless forms of pain. There are also unnecessary forms of pain, like once you harmed yourself and you know that and you fix it, you don't really need to be reminded about that all the time. Suffering is a bit more tricky. Are there forms of suffering that you actually benefit from? Some philosophers would say, yes, if I do something bad, I should kind of suffer and they say, oh, that was bad. Oh, I'm so ashamed of that. That suffering is hopefully a learning signal that makes me behave well. That's great, up to a point. But many of us go on, late in night, we wake up and I remember something bad I did to a kid in school decades ago. Yep, probably the kid has hopefully forgotten about that, but I'm awake about and suffering about something. And maybe it's still adjusting my severity. But most likely it's just necessary.
Great. Let's take another question from the audience. Isn't it possible that evolving to create our own reward introduce a long-term factor in our reinforcement learning gain function? A factor that benefits the species rather than the individual from a revolutionary perspective?
Yeah, this is a fascinating issue. So evolutionary biology has been having this long-running argument about group selection. Are there any evolution happens that benefits the species or at least some family or larger group rather than individuals or individual genes? And the general consensus is something like, it can happen, but it's so fragile that it very rarely happens in general. But we are a weird species. We have a name for our own species. We have several names. We create institutions like the United Nations. We quite often lie awake at night thinking, oh, our species is doing stupid things. We should stop doing that. How can we set up institutions and incentives and policies to prevent us from doing stupid things? And this is, of course, a civilizational cognitive system in a sense. In many ways, a society and a civilization can be viewed very much like the mouse brain. You have a perception from the outside world. You have various forms of reinforcement signals generated inside and coming from the outside, and you have behavior. We can actually construct our own reinforcement system. The problem is sometimes we do this in a stupid way, and then we get into deep problem. But I think this is the evolution we are going to be aiming at.
Awesome. So given our current global crisis that everybody is experiencing, do you have any practical advice you can give to the global audience from your field of work?
I think generally having hope is quite useful because one of the big problems is in the modern media saturated world, we always get the most salient signals, the signals that seem to be low probability or high amplitude. Something really horrible happened in a faraway country. We get to hear about it, and we can imagine ourselves being suffering from that. We hear about really uncannily unlikely bad events or bad people. This creates a weird probability distribution because we're building a probability distribution about what the world is like. And the more you watch television, the more afraid you are of being a victim of crime. And the same thing is true also for all the other media. We need to find a way of adjusting that. So my personal trick, when I'm noticing that I'm starting to get riled up by the media, I go to Our World in Data and look at statistics. It quietens things down. You actually can see what is the actual state here. What are the trends? And many of the trends are actually fairly okay. There are still a lot of things to fight against. There is a lot of poverty, there is a lot of malaria, there are a lot of really crappy politicians and bad governance and wars out there. But actually, we are doing a lot of things right. And having that hope gives you the optimism, both that things can get better and, oh, I should be trying to help things out. The pessimist might say, yeah, that's never going to work, and besides, things are getting bad. But when they're right, well, that self-fulfilling prophecy doesn't make them happy. The optimist would say, okay, that didn't work, but let's try something else.
Awesome. I think that's a very wise advice to everyone experiencing COVID right now. So last question before we close the talk. I think the talk covers extremely wide disciplines and different views about happiness, from meeting needs, removing suffering, to a key component of human flourishing. And especially there is a big element from the futuristic perspective, which is mind-blowing. To summarize the talk, what does happiness mean to you, and how would you like the societies to think about happiness?
I think happiness is a form of learning. As I explained earlier, it's certainly a product of learning how to do things better. But I also think the best forms of happiness are those open-ended, sustainable ones, which means that you found something that is worthwhile to pursue in all sorts of directions to explore. I think the wonderful thing about our universe, which is really weird, the laws of physics are really odd in that they seem to allow this open-ended exploration, which is not easy. Many of these things are going to be require tremendous intelligence, energy, and the sacrifice to achieve. But yet, it looks like we're living in a universe where we can grow and flourish. That is wonderful, and that makes me very, very happy.
Amazing. Thank you very much for the optimism and all the happiness that you bring to the audience today. Thank you again, Professor Anders Sandberg. Thank you everyone for watching the talk. Please tune in for future talks at Google sessions. Thank you.
Stay safe.